1694, the year money stopped being real. Why central banks exist. It wasn't for stability. If you walk into the Bank of England today, you will feel like you are entering a fortress. Thick stone walls rise like cliffs. Guards in pink tailcoats stand at attention. This building occupies an entire city block in London's financial district. We look at it, and we think it has always been there. We think it represents stability, prudence, and careful planning. We imagine it was built by wise men with white beards who believed in saving money and living within your means. That is the lie. The Bank of England was not born from stability. It was born from desperation. It was not founded to protect your savings. It was founded to create money out of thin air. And the man who invented it was not a saint. He was a pirate. His name was William Paterson. And in the year 1694, he walked into the court of King William III with a plan so audacious that it changed the nature of money forever. He promised the king that he could raise £1,200,000 in gold in less than 2 weeks. And he promised something even more impossible. He promised that after lending all that gold to the king, his company could still act like it had the money. They would print paper. They would call it currency. And people would use it as if it were real. This was not economics. This was alchemy. And it worked. But to understand why Paterson's scheme succeeded, we have to understand what was happening in London in 1694. We have to understand the ledger. Because the truth of history is this: nations do not fall because of bad generals. They fall because of bad balance sheets. And in 1694, England's balance sheet was a catastrophe. King William III was a cold, humorless Dutch prince who had seized the English throne 5 years earlier. He had one obsession in life. He wanted to destroy King Louis XIV of France. Louis was the Sun King. He lived in the golden halls of Versailles. He commanded the largest army in Europe. He had fleets of warships and tens of thousands of cavalry. William looked at Louis, and he saw a threat that had to be crushed. So he dragged England into a war called the 9 Years' War. It was fought in Flanders, in Ireland, on the open seas. Soldiers died by the thousands. Ships sank. Castles burned. But wars are not won by courage. They are won by cash. And England did not have any. The English treasury was empty. The tax system was medieval. The king tried taxing windows, salt, and land. It was never enough. By 1693, the situation was critical. Soldiers were going unpaid. Suppliers refused to deliver gunpowder. Ships rotted in harbor because there was no money to repair them. In 1690, the French Navy defeated the English fleet at the Battle of Beachy Head. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the French might invade England. Panic spread through the streets of London. Women hid their jewelry. Men armed themselves with whatever they could find. King William needed gold, and he needed it immediately. He went to the goldsmiths of London. These were the wealthy merchants who stored gold in their vaults and lent it out for interest. In the past, kings could borrow from goldsmiths by simply asking, but the goldsmiths were tired of kings. They remembered what happened in 1672. King Charles II had borrowed a fortune from the London goldsmiths. Then he simply refused to pay it back. He called it the stop of the exchequer. It was a default. It was a bankruptcy. It ruined dozens of banking families overnight. The goldsmiths learned a hard lesson. Kings are terrible debtors. So when William came asking for a loan, the goldsmiths crossed their arms. They demanded interest rates of 20%. They demanded collateral. They treated the King of England like a beggar. William's government tried issuing debt using wooden sticks called tally sticks. These were pieces of willow with notches carved into them to represent the amount owed. The stick was split in half. The government kept one piece. The creditor kept the other. When it was time to pay, the two halves were matched like a puzzle. It was primitive. It was honest. But you cannot fight a modern war with wooden sticks. England was losing. Not because their soldiers were weak, but because their treasury was empty. And that is when William Paterson appeared. Paterson was born in Scotland in 1658. He came from nothing, but he was a man of ferocious ambition and relentless energy. As a young man, he left Scotland and sailed to the Caribbean. He spent years in Jamaica and the Bahamas. What he did there is murky. He claimed he was a merchant and a preacher. But the rumors in London said something else. They said he was a buccaneer. They said he sailed with pirates. The Caribbean in the 1680s was the golden age of piracy. It was a place where men seized Spanish treasure ships and made fortunes overnight. It was a place where the laws of Europe did not reach. Paterson certainly had the mind of a pirate. He understood risk. He understood leverage. He understood that if you want to win big, you have to bet everything. When he returned to London, he was wealthy. He wore fine clothes. He spoke quickly. He had 1,000 ideas. He was what we would call today a hustler, a promoter, a man who could sell ice in winter. He looked at King William's desperate situation, and he saw opportunity. He saw that the old system of borrowing was broken. The goldsmiths were too cautious. Their vaults were too small. Paterson had traveled to Amsterdam. He had seen the Bank of Amsterdam. He knew that the Dutch could borrow money cheaper than the English because they had a public bank. But Paterson wanted to go further than the Dutch. He came up with a plan so radical that most people thought he was insane. He proposed creating a private company, a company of merchants. This company would raise £1,200,000 in gold from private investors. This was a staggering sum. It was more than the king could raise in an entire year of taxation. The company would lend this entire pile of gold to the king, all of it. In exchange, the king would pay the company 8% interest per year. So far, this sounds like a normal loan, a very large loan, but still a loan. But here is where Paterson performed his magic trick. He asked the king to grant the company a royal charter, and in that charter, he asked for a special privilege. He asked for the right to issue paper notes to the value of the loan. Let that sink in. Paterson was saying that even though the company had lent its gold to the king, even though the gold was gone, spent on gunpowder and warships, the company could still act as if it had the money. They could print pieces of paper that said, "Promise to pay the bearer on demand." And because these notes were backed by government debt, people would trust them. They would use them as money. This meant the company could lend the money twice. They lent the gold to the king. Then they lent the paper to the public. They earned interest from the king. They earned interest from the public. It was alchemy. It was creating money out of nothing. Paterson himself said it plainly. The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing. Today, we call this fractional reserve banking. We call it fiat currency. But in 1694 it was revolutionary. And to many people it was terrifying. The Tories, the conservative landowners, hated the idea. They believed money should be based on land and gold, not on paper promises. The goldsmiths hated it because it would destroy their business. They warned that this new bank would become a monster. They said it would buy up all the land in England. They said it would enslave the king to a group of faceless bankers. But King William did not care about philosophy. He cared about winning the war. He looked at Paterson's plan, and he saw one thing. £1,200,000. He saw a fleet of new warships. He saw paid soldiers. He saw the defeat of France. So he gave the order. The government passed the Tonnage Act of 1694. It was called the Tonnage Act because it included new taxes on ships to pay the interest on the loan. Hidden inside this tax bill was the charter for the governor and company of the Bank of England. Now Paterson had to prove his idea would work. He had to raise the money. The subscription books opened on June 21st, 1694. The location was Mercer's Hall in Cheapside. Paterson and his partners were nervous. Would the people of London trust this new invention? Would they hand over their gold for paper and a promise? The response shocked everyone. It was electric. It was the first great financial mania in London. Merchants, lawyers, widows, and aristocrats lined up to buy shares in the bank. The King and Queen subscribed first. They put down £10,000. This gave the project royal approval. The entire sum of £1,200,000 was raised in just 11 days. 11 days. It was a miracle. The gold poured in. The clerks could barely count the coins fast enough. Paterson was triumphant. He had done the impossible. He had capitalized the war in less than 2 weeks. The gold was immediately loaded onto wagons and sent to the army in Flanders. Almost overnight, the tide of the war began to turn. English soldiers were paid. Suppliers were paid. The navy was refitted. King Louis XIV in Versailles was baffled. He could not understand where this little island was getting so much money. He was the richest king in Europe, but his treasury was running dry. He was taxing his peasants into starvation. England had found a way to tap into the future. They were fighting on credit. William Paterson became a director of the new Bank of England. He was the man of the hour. He walked the streets of London like a hero. But as often happens with visionaries, Paterson was better at starting things than managing them. The bank set up shop in Grocers' Hall. They hired 17 clerks and a gatekeeper. They began issuing the first banknotes. These were not like the bills you carry today. They were large, handwritten notes. They were signed by the cashier. They were often for odd amounts, like £55 and 6 shillings. But they worked. Merchants accepted them. Trade flowed more smoothly. But Paterson grew bored. He found the daily business of banking tedious. Sitting in meetings discussing interest rates was not for him. He began to clash with the other directors. They were sober, cautious men. They were Huguenot merchants and Whig politicians. They wanted to run the bank carefully. Paterson wanted to gamble. He proposed using the bank's money to fund other schemes. He suggested a fund for orphans, which sounded charitable, but was actually a high-risk investment vehicle. The other directors were horrified. They realized that having a former pirate on the board was dangerous. Within 1 year of founding the bank, William Paterson was forced out. He was pushed to resign. He sold his stock and walked away from the institution he had created. It is one of the great ironies of history. The father of the Bank of England was fired by his own child. But Paterson did not disappear. He returned to his old dreams. He came up with an even bigger idea. He proposed the Darien scheme, a plan to build a colony in Panama. It would eventually bankrupt Scotland. But that is a tragedy for another time. Back in London, the Bank of England faced its first existential crisis. The year was 1696. The bank was only 2 years old, and it was about to face a perfect storm. The problem was the silver coin. For centuries, England's currency had been silver pennies and silver shillings, but the coins had smooth edges. This meant thieves could clip the edges with shears. They would file the coin to make it look round again. They kept the clippings and melted them into bullion. They spent the clipped coin at full value. Over decades, this destroyed the currency. By 1695, the average shilling in circulation had lost half its weight. It was a thin, deformed disc of metal. People lost faith. Shopkeepers refused to accept clipped coins. There were riots in the markets. The government decided to fix it. They recalled all the old coins and minted new ones with milled edges that could not be clipped. This was the Great Recoinage. It was a noble idea, but the execution was a disaster. The government demonetized the old coins before minting enough new ones. Suddenly, there was no silver in London. Cash disappeared. People panicked. They ran to the banks to withdraw their deposits. They wanted their money. But remember the secret of the Bank of England. They had lent the gold to the king. The gold was gone. They only had paper. On May 6, 1696, a mob gathered outside Grocers' Hall. They waved their banknotes and demanded gold. The directors looked into their vaults. They did not have enough coin to pay everyone. If they failed, the bank would collapse. The king's war funding would collapse. The French would win. The directors made a desperate decision. They partially suspended payments. They told people they could only pay 10% of the note's value in cash. For the rest, they issued IOUs. It was a default. The enemies of the bank cheered. The goldsmiths were delighted. They hoped this arrogant company would die. But the bank had powerful friends. The government could not let it fail. The Chancellor intervened. He ordered tax collectors to accept Bank of England notes for tax payments. This was the master stroke. By making the notes valid for taxes, the government forced people to use them. It created demand. If you needed to pay taxes, you needed a banknote. Therefore, the note had value.
This established a principle that holds true today. Currency has value because the government demands it for taxes. The bank survived the crisis of 1696, but it was close. During this crisis, another famous figure entered the story, Isaac Newton. Yes, the man who discovered gravity. In 1696, Newton moved from Cambridge to London to become warden of the Royal Mint. His job was to oversee production of the new silver coins. He was responsible for solving the cash shortage. Newton took the job seriously. He became a detective. He hunted counterfeiters and clippers. He interrogated them in the Tower of London. He sent men to the gallows. Newton understood that for the new system to work, there had to be trust. The paper of the bank and the silver of the mint had to be beyond suspicion. While Newton fixed the coins, the Bank of England fixed its political power. They realized survival depended on being useful to the state. They became the government's banker. They managed the national debt. Every time the king needed money for war, and there were many wars in the 18th century, he came to the bank. The bank printed more notes. The army got supplies. The British Empire expanded. It was symbiotic. The bank funded the empire. The empire protected the bank. By the 1700s, the Bank of England moved to its permanent home on Threadneedle Street. It built fortress walls. It hired guards. It became the symbol of British power. But the pirate spirit of William Paterson was never fully exorcised. The bank was still a private company. It was owned by shareholders. Its primary goal was profit. And this tension between private profit and public duty led to the next catastrophe. The South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company was created in 1711 as a rival to the Bank of England. It copied Paterson's model. It took over government debt in exchange for a monopoly on trade with South America. In 1720, South Sea Company stock went parabolic. The price went from 100 to 1,000 in months. It was a mania that gripped the entire nation. The Bank of England was tempted to merge with the South Sea Company. If they had, the bank would have collapsed when the bubble burst. But at the last minute, they pulled out. When the crash came in late 1720, it wiped out thousands. It bankrupted aristocrats and scientists, including Isaac Newton himself. The South Sea Company was disgraced, but the Bank of England survived. Because they survived the crash, they became the lender of last resort. This is when the bank truly became a central bank. It was not just the government's bank, it became the bank for other banks. When other banks faced trouble, they came to Threadneedle Street for bailouts. The system Paterson invented in 1694 became the operating system of the British Empire. It allowed Britain, a small island nation, to punch far above its weight. It allowed Britain to outspend France in the Napoleonic Wars.